Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Now, in this week's episode, I want to return to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8. Now, this is a prophecy that I've touched on, I've discussed in recent episodes. This is a chapter, a prophecy that I expect to continue to come back to over the next several months and years. I am increasingly convinced, as I've said, that this may be one of the clearest prophecies outlining what is beginning to unfold right now in the earth, specifically in the Middle East. Now, in the news just recently, we've had really a series of different events that have grabbed the headlines over the past several months. Obviously, Russia moving troops into the Middle East. This is a profound game changer. Now, in more recent times, we had the Saudi Arabian government, the Saudi Arabian family, executed a handful of prominent Shia Muslims in their country, including one very prominent cleric. And this resulted, of course, in amazing protests, the Saudi embassy in Tehran actually being attacked by protesters. I think it was firebombed. And then the Iranian embassies were closed down in various Arabic cities, capitals throughout the Middle East. So the tension is rising. I want to take some time again, briefly, to look at Daniel chapter 8. We're just going to sort of highlight some of the main features of this prophecy, and then I want to go back to some of what's unfolding in the region and talk about what we may expect to see next in the Middle East. So let's go ahead and turn back to Daniel chapter 8. And so beginning in verse 1, Daniel says, "In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me subsequent to the one previously." Okay, so he's talking about Daniel 7, the vision that appeared to him previously. "I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa." Now, this is in what is modern-day Iran. Okay, so Daniel is no longer in Babylon, or at least in the spirit, he is now in the region of what would be Persia or modern-day Iran, the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. "And I looked, and in the vision, I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Behold, a ram which had two horns was standing in front of the canal." Now, the two horns were long, but one was longer than the other. So you have a ram with two horns, one horn longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. "I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself." Then in verse 5, "While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground." So now first we have the ram, now we have the goat. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. Some translations say a singular or a prominent horn. "He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and he rushed at him in mighty wrath." So there's this conflict between the ram and the goat. Verse 7, "I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at the ram. He was enraged at the ram. He struck the ram. He shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground. He trampled on him, and there was none to rescue from his power. Then the male goat became exceeding, he magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, as soon as he was great, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven." And verse 9, out of these four horns that come up out of the goat, one of them, verse 9, came forth a rather small horn. So out of one of these four horns comes forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Okay, so it comes up, it grows up, and it grows exceedingly great, specifically toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Now, the beautiful land most often is understood as referring to the Holy Land, the land of Israel, the promised land, the city that God has put his name on, Jerusalem. So then in verse 10 through 12, speaking of the little horn, it says, "It grew up to the host of heaven, and it caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth." So it grows up, it causes some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. It removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. On account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. The little horn, again, will fling truth to the ground, perform its will, and prosper. Arguably, the Antichrist and the scriptures say that he will perform his will and prosper. All that he does will prosper. For a very brief time, he will prosper. So, that is essentially the vision. That's the vision that Daniel was given. Now, the remainder of the chapter is the angel Gabriel comes and actually explains and interprets and gives us understanding concerning the vision. Now, if you turn to most Christian commentaries, if you read just about any book on this particular chapter, again, overwhelmingly, the interpretation will be that of the verses that we just looked at, that verses 3 through 8, which is the portion of the vision, which includes the ram, the goat, and then the 4 horns that come up out of the goat, virtually every commentary will say, this is historical. This speaks of Alexander the Great. It speaks of the Medo-Persian invasion of the Middle East and then the response by Alexander the Great. It speaks of Alexander's death and then the 4 successors that came up after Alexander. And then what they'll say is that in verses 9 through 12, right in the middle of the vision, the portion about the little horn is where the vision shifts, and it suddenly is dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes in history, but ultimately it's speaking of the Antichrist. So most commentators break the vision up into a portion which is partially historical and then partially end time, partially eschatological, pertaining to the last days. So again, this is really the most widely held interpretation. There are a wide variety of different interpretations within that, but that general approach is how most understand the text. Now, as I have been repeatedly emphasizing, what I am increasingly convinced of is what I call the consistent futurist interpretation of the text. And what that means is that I understand the entire vision from verses 3 all the way through 12. All of it has, yes, historical foreshadows, that there are events in history that you can see that were fulfilled as sort of a type, a foreshadow. But the entire prophecy, its ultimate fulfillment, its primary meaning concerns the last days. It's primarily an end-time prophecy. But for now, I just want to touch on just a few of the key elements of the prophecy to highlight why I believe that it is an end-time prophecy. So really you have 3 or 4 primary leading arguments, okay, in terms of why the entire prophecy should be understood as an end-time prophecy. First of all, the book of Revelation tells us that the little horn is the Antichrist. The book of Revelation, chapter 12, which we'll look at, makes it very clear that the little horn is the Antichrist. So we understand that at the very least, from verses 9 through 12, the portion about the little horn is not just Antiochus Epiphanes, but yes, it is an end-time prophecy. Second, Gabriel the angel, 3 times, which we will look at, states very clearly that this is an end-time prophecy, that its subject matter concerns the last days. Third, the little horn, as we will examine, the little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes, did not expand mightily toward the east. When you actually look at the career of Antiochus Epiphanes, he already controlled the entire eastern areas, and in fact, during his reign, the Parthians began moving, and he started losing the eastern portions of his kingdom, and that's where it sat actually at his death. And then fourth, Alexander's empire, and this is critical. This is probably one of the huge points that you will not find in virtually any Christian commentary. The bottom line is Alexander's empire did not break up into four. And this is so widely held, so widely taught, that when I say this, people are like, what are you talking about? And this is just a well-known fact of history. But the bottom line is it's not true, and we'll look at that. So very briefly, let's look at each of these arguments. So first of all, as I said, Revelation connects the little horn to the last days. So again, we've already read it, but in Daniel 8, 10 through 12, it speaks of the little horn. It says it grew up to the host of heaven. It caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth. It trampled them down. And I've pointed out elsewhere that throughout the scriptures, nowhere are humans referred to as stars, other than as symbolically, or sort of metaphorical, allegorical references. But it never refers to humans as stars. It refers to angels as stars consistently. And it certainly never refers to humans as the host of heaven. It'll call people the host all the time, but it never refers to humans as the host of heaven. So this is a significant point. And it says he magnified himself to be equal to the commander of the host. Now, I'm convinced that Paul in 2 Thessalonians, when he's speaking of the Antichrist setting himself up in the temple of God, is actually referencing this portion of Daniel 8, as well as almost quoting verbatim Daniel chapter 11. When he says that the Antichrist will set himself up in the temple of God, proclaiming himself as God, and all of the things that the son of perdition, the man of lawlessness, will do, Paul is actually hearkening back to Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. So he's referencing the little horn and the king of the north, making it very clear that the little horn and the king of the north are one and the same. They are the one that we call the Antichrist. The Bible, the scriptures use multiple titles, multiple names for this individual. So he raises himself up to be equal to the commander of the host. Again, that's clearly a reference to Jesus, to Yeshua, the Messiah. That's something Antiochus did not do. So he removed the regular sacrifice. Again, this is something that Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel in Daniel 8, Daniel 9, 11, and 12, all reference as something the Antichrist will do. In the place of his sanctuary, that's the commander of the host, was thrown down. On account of transgression, the host will be given over to the little horn along with the regular sacrifice. He will fling truth to the ground and perform his will and prosper. Okay, so the little horn is going to cause the sanctuary of the commander of the host, in other words, the temple, the house of God, the house of the Messiah, my Father's house, as Jesus called it, that will be thrown down, and the regular sacrifice will be abolished. Now, again, this is something that Jesus referenced as being yet future. Paul clearly spoke of it as the son of perdition setting himself up in the temple of God as something future from Paul's time, and that's not something that Titus ever did. That's not something in history that we can point to after Jesus and Paul and say that it's been fulfilled. It has not been fulfilled yet. So here's the kicker, is in Revelation 12, verses 3 through 11, we have it says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns." This is Satan. "And on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth." So here in Revelation, the divine author of Revelation is revealing to John the Apostle that the events spoken of in Daniel 8, because this is a direct reference back to Daniel 8, is in fact an end-time event, because as we read further in the chapter, it clearly says that these are events that will take place in the last days, specifically in the final 3.5 years before the return of Jesus. It says the great red dragon, this is verse 9, was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Verse 10, "Then the angels declare, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ, his Messiah, hath come, for the accuser of our brethren has been cast down, He who accuses them before God day and night. For this reason rejoice, O you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing he only has a short time. So you have the clear references to just this very brief period just before the return of Jesus. Satan is enraged because he knows he only has a short time. The triumph, the victory of the Messiah has come. His kingdom has come. These are clearly end-time events. And so here, the divine author of Revelation, God himself, the Word of God, makes it clear that the events in Daniel 8, spoken of in Daniel 8, are end-time prophecies. Next, Gabriel makes it very clear that this prophecy speaks of the end times. Again, he makes it, abundantly clear. So in verse 15, beginning in verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the Ulai Canal. And he called out and he said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So Gabriel the angel is now about to explain the vision to Daniel. Verse 17, so he came near to me where I was standing. And when he came, I was frightened. I fell on my face. But Gabriel said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Gabriel the angel says, Daniel, understand, listen, hear me. The vision that you just saw, it pertains to the time of the end. Verse 18, now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. He touches Daniel, he lifts him up, and he continues. He reiterates what he just stated. Verse 19, behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So again, 3 times, Gabriel tells Daniel, listen, Daniel, hear me. And he reiterates it. He emphasizes it. The vision concerns the time of the end. He doesn't say, Daniel, understand that from verses 3 through 8, verses 3 through 9, this part is history, but then this portion of the prophecy is future. No, he just says the vision pertains to the time of the end, the final period of indignation. Okay, so that's pretty clear. That's pretty emphatic. If we take the words of Gabriel seriously, which I believe we should, then the only way to read this prophecy is as an end-time prophecy, if we simply take his words at face value. Third issue, Antiochus did not expand east. He did not expand in a mighty way east. Again, we won't really dig into this much, but let me just say this. Antiochus, his capital was Antakya today. This is in Turkey. If you look at a map of Turkey, there's sort of that little section. It's called the Hatay province, which extends down into Syria. It's sort of a contested region. Syria thinks it should be theirs. It's the more Arabic portion of Turkey. And in the Hatay province is Antakya. That's ancient Antioch. That was the capital of Antiochus Epiphanes. That was where that's where he reigned from. Now, during his reign, during his career, he was repeatedly engaged with military conflict with the Ptolemies in Egypt, and he was going down. And in fact, he expanded his power down to the Ptolemaic kingdom and toward the beautiful land, which is, again, the land of Israel. We know that Antiochus exerted his control over Israel. But he never expanded to the east because he was the ruler of the Seleucid or Seleucid dynasty. He already controlled that whole area east, and all of the roads which were controlled, which allowed the trade routes all the way from India. He already controlled it. But it was in his latter years, it was actually 167 BC, that King Mithridates, the king of Parthia, he actually made a move on some of the central cities that were to the east of Antiochus. And Antiochus went and engaged some of them, and he actually retook some of the areas that they had taken. But then in the midst of all of that, he died. He died. And so the point is this: he never expanded further east. He never grew mightily east. In fact, he was at war trying to maintain control of some of his eastern provinces, and he lost some of his eastern provinces. So history says that what took place with Antiochus is actually just the opposite of what will be fulfilled with the little horn. The little horn specifically will expand mightily to the east. Finally, and this is the big one, Alexander's empire did not break up into four. Now, again, as I've said, this is an idea that is repeated 1,000,000 times over in the commentaries, but the bottom line is when you actually carefully read the history of the Alexandrian Empire after he died, all of the events that unfolded, it's anything but simple. In fact, it was quite a mess, and you had a series of wars referred to as the Wars of the Diadochi. These things raged on for 30 to 50 years as all of these different successors were fighting for control of Alexander's empire, his dominion. Ultimately, these guys wanted to be the next Alexander. They were all fighting for his legacy. They wanted to be the one that sort of retook his throne and reclaimed control of the entire empire. No one ever was able to do that. It was largely fought between several, not just four, but several different successors. But ultimately, roughly 30 years after Alexander died, or between 25 to 30 years, it had really come down, not to four, but it had come down to five primary successors. And ultimately, the leader of the Seleucid dynasty finally conquered Antigonus. Antigonus was he was the one that came the closest to controlling the entire empire. But in his old age, in his 80s, he was finally defeated by the ruler of the Seleucid dynasty. Antigonus was defeated. And this is where some people try to say, well, this is where we finally had four. Again, this is 25, 30 years after Alexander died. But the fact of the matter is that Antigonus's son, Demetrius, took over another section of the kingdom. So you still had five. But really, when you look at history, when you study it, by this point, there were only two primary, big, significant rulers. And then there were a handful of other smaller rulers. But there was never a time where you had four clear successors. History, the historical events of the breakup of Alexander's empire does not line up with the prophecy. And this is critical. When prophecy is fulfilled, it is fulfilled precisely. So we're going to take a brief break right here, and we'll be back right after this.
For this week's program, we are offering the Understanding the Times Prophecy DVD bundle. This important resource bundle includes the following four resources. Joel's newest teaching, Where is America in Bible Prophecy DVD. This dynamic two-session teaching DVD addresses all of the critical biblical passages that many have said point to the United States. Could the United States be Mystery Babylon, as many students of prophecy now believe? Find out in the Where in the United States in Bible Prophecy DVD. Second, you will receive the What Comes Next in the Middle East DVD. This three-session teaching DVD examines the two critical passages of Daniel chapter 8 and Isaiah 19, understanding what is happening right now in the Middle East and what may be next on the prophetic horizon. Third, you will receive the Understanding the Times DVD. This four-session DVD addresses the gospel of the kingdom, the Jewish temple, and the coming covenant, and two sessions on identifying Mystery Babylon. And finally, as a bonus, you will receive Joel's documentary, End Times Eyewitness. This dynamic documentary film, shot on location throughout the Middle East, explores the unfolding signs of the return of Jesus. Together, all four items are only $55. To order, go to joelstrumpet.com and click on the Understanding the Times DVD bundle.
So what do we do with this? Well, again, if we understand it, if we understand this prophecy as being eschatological, then what that means is this, is that in the last days, before the return of Jesus, the Medo-Persian Ram is going to invade the Middle East, is going to break out militarily into the region. Now, when we look at the region right now, it is already setting up for this. It's already setting up for an Iranian invasion of the Middle East. Everyone is looking for Gog Magog. They're looking for Psalm 83. So many different prophecies. And those are all valid prophecies. Those are prophecies that will be fulfilled. But first, I'm, as I said, increasingly convinced, and I could be wrong about this. I'm putting this out here for the watchers to watch. Now, some people will say, well, why bother, Joel? What's the point of this? Listen, Jesus commanded us to understand the signs of the times. He commanded us to understand the scriptures as they related to the signs of the times. You know, you have a lot of people who say, you should never interpret the Bible based on the newspaper. That's newspaper exegesis. Well, listen, I agree that you should never allow your interpretation of the scriptures to be dictated by the newspapers, that you don't begin with the newspaper and then turn to the scriptures. You need to understand the scriptures. But the bottom line is the scriptures will relate and give clarity to what's taking place in the earth, the signs of the times. Jesus rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees. He said, you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. In other words, the signs that are out there in the earth. So this is something Jesus expects us to do. We are to be watchful. As we are watching the signs unfold, we are to be alert. We are to be prayerful so that we understand the seasons that we are in. If Iran invades the Middle East, if Iran breaks out, then we say, okay, now we can look for the goat from the west to come in and crush the ram. And I would argue that that is most likely Turkey. Now, here's the point that I want to make, and here is what we need to look for in this next year. If Iran breaks out into the Middle East, and Russia has now jumped in and is siding with Iran, Saudi Arabia is obviously furthering this matter, pressing the issue by purposefully executing a prominent Shia cleric, by stirring up all of this strong Sunni-Shi'a conflict. They're pushing the regional conflict further. If Iran, if the ram breaks out into the region, and again, this could happen in the next few years, it could take a long time, then we are to watch for the next sign, which is the ram, which is the goat from the west. If the goat from the west comes, then we understand that these are the signs that are leading to the rise of the Antichrist. This gives us tremendous clarity into the times, the seasons that we are in, and that we are quickly approaching the return of Jesus. Now again, folks, we don't know. Jesus made it very clear. No one knows the day or the hour. And when it comes to timing, these things are easy to miss. Oftentimes we peer into the scriptures, we think we have clarity on the timing, but we don't. We need to approach these things humbly. I'm not coming to you dogmatically saying this is that. But when I look at the events in the Middle East, I look at what's unfolding. I look at this increasing conflict, this polarization between the Sunnis and the Shia. I see Russia having stepped into the Middle East. I believe that this prophecy could potentially be very close to being fulfilled. If it is fulfilled, it will affect everyone. If Iran engages in a full-blown regional Middle Eastern war, this will affect the whole world. This will affect your pocketbook. This will affect the global economy. Oil, all of these things. If our allies, Saudi Arabia, go to war, this is going to impact the whole world. We need to be paying attention to these things. We need to be watching and praying. Well, listen, folks, I think this is about all the time that we have for this week. I actually want to return to this prophecy and deal with it a bit more and really plunge into some of the current events and how they are directly relating to this prophecy. But for now, let us be watchful. Let us be prayerful. I want to thank you again for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.